Hey guys, want to do a quick video here on my most recent game, but before I got to that, I did kind of want to point out some stats. First off, I can't remember if I told you guys the story or not of how I came up with this name or why my in-game name is Agent Cornbread on Lichess. This was supposed to be my throwaway account, my fake account that I started to not care about my rating, you know, and then once I understood the game well enough and I played well enough and I could have a decent rating, then I would get my real account out, right? And then I could show off my rating to the world. I knew that as I started playing chess that my rating was not going to be great, and I wanted a way not to care about my stats, right? When you focus on stats, I think that you start taking things too seriously, and you kind of lose the fun of it. So I made a fake account in order for me to not care about the stats. Except it's kind of turned into a lot more fun than I thought. So I'm still going to hold off on making my air quotes real account and continue to pretend that this is my fake account, so that way I don't actually care about my rating. However, Lichess keeps track of your rating, which is really nice. And look at this: since November of last year, before that was, if you want to scroll back, before that is the placement games. You start off, everyone starts off at 1500. You can see, like, if you look at my bullet rating, like, I haven't actually played any bullet games. So everyone starts out at a provisional 1500, and then you move up and down depending on your placement games. And you can see my placement games drop me way down here to the bottom, down into the thousands. But if we look at something like from around here or so, kind of my lowest point at 1000 rating, over the last 6 months, my rating has steadily increased pretty significantly, and I'm damn proud of that, actually. This section in the middle is where I kind of stopped playing rapid games and focused more on longer time formats, specifically classical and correspondence style games, just to try to slow down the game and kind of think more through my games. And then I got back into the rapid games, and you could see my improvement has just continually gone up. So first off, I wanted to thank you guys for playing games against me to help me learn and get better. But secondly, I wanted to show that this really basic level of studying that I'm doing, this very basic, minimal kind of effort that I'm putting into kind of learning some of this stuff, is really paying off massive dividends. Most of this is basically just the opening principles and then learning a few tricks of some openings. And we'll go over that here in a little bit. But my rating has almost hit 1400 a couple of times now, and I honestly did not believe that I would rate that high. Now, that's, in the grand scheme of things, it's still not very high of a rating, but it's a heck of a lot better than I thought I would be, and I'm still having fun. Like, that's the main point, is I'm still enjoying playing chess, so I'm going to keep my fake account for a little bit longer, and honestly, like, between you and me, I don't know that I'm ever going to get a real account. Like, Agent Cornbread is now my real account because it has this cool history of showing my improvement, but I'm going to keep telling myself that it's a fake account. That way I don't get hung up on the actual rating. Like, once I break a threshold, I'm not going to stop playing and say, hey, see, I hit like my correspondence games. I hit 1600 on my correspondence. I'm never going to play a correspondence again because I don't want to lose my rating. Well, that's not true, because you can see over the last dozen games my rating continually goes down on correspondence. Which, to be fair, this probably will come closer to alignment of what my rapid rating is. I'm probably somewhere between these two, right? Somewhere between 1300 and 1600, possibly, is my air quote real rating. Anyway, so this is my fake account, but it's kind of my real account too. So that's why I wanted to kind of point out that where that name came from and why it shows up as Agent Cornbread. All right, so here is a game I recently played, and spoilers, you saw that it ended in a checkmate, but I wanted to quickly point out the main reason for showing this game is the transposing into a certain board position. Now, if we look at the Opening Explorer is going to give us a different name of the actual move order, even though we end up in almost an identical board position. So when we talk about named openings, there are very minor differences when you start getting down to it. And even these minor variations, switching a move order, maybe pushing a pawn before you move a knight, or moving a knight and then pushing the pawn, like just that minor difference can have completely different names, because one turn is all it takes to win or lose a game, which we'll see here. So I'm going to leave the opening explorer on so we can see the names of these openings, but we transpose into Queen's Gambit Declined. So this is going to go into my Queen's Gambit Declined series, if you will, right? The playlist. Anyway, so my opponent starts with a knight move, the ready opening. I respond with a knight move. I don't know if that's the correct knight, so that's the second most common knight response, but I've done this knight to a f6 move many times, fully expecting to go into a Queen's Gambit Decline, because that's the move order that's the opening I'm familiar with. But it's still flexible enough that if we were to go into, say, a standard Italian game, like, I can still respond normally. Many times these knights end up on these two squares anyway, so being flexible is what it's all about. My opponent then pushes d4, so now I'm fully on board the Queen's Gambit board position. Notice the opening here is particularly called, this is transitioned from the ready game, the reti opening, into an Indian game variation. My opponent continues with this pawn structure, which we've seen in the Queen's Gambit line. We've seen where the bishop ends up on d2, right? This pawn ends up here and the knight ends up here. We've seen this, so it's still possible going into the Queen's Gambit line, so I'm going to continue playing what I want to do. And notice now the opening is called the, I can't pronounce that, the Yusupov-Rubinstein system. So I don't know why this has a specific name, but it's notice it's a slightly different turn order. I continue on with what I know is Black's response to the Queen's Gambit Declined, and now we've transitioned to the Kali system. I honestly have never heard of this before, so one of my homeworks one day when I have time is I'm going to look this up and see why this has a separate name, even though it looks like we're going into what's essentially going to be a Queen's Gambit Declined type position. As soon as my opponent pushes this pawn, this becomes a well-known opening that I'm familiar with. Now they don't. They continue on with a slightly different move order. Now, in sometimes we have seen, when I played the Queen's Gambit line, we've seen this bishop end up on d3. The dark square bishop ends up on d2. We've seen that before. So it's like, okay, I'm still okay with this. I still know what's going on. So I'm going to continue with my normal standard development. From here on out, the opening, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. It stays as this Kali system. We don't, we have now deviated from the norm, so we're not going to hit any more named openings. We're 5 moves in, so we're kind of done with the typical named openings anyway, but I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. All right, so my opponent castles, and I know that I'm probably going to castle too. The only thing I have to do is figure out what to do with my dark square bishop. Well, we've seen that in a few times the dark square bishop can end up on d7, so I park it on d7 or e7. Excuse me, can't talk today. Park it up on e7. My opponent does make this early a pawn move. I've done this myself before, and in fact, I'm considering doing that now. Like, I'm considering I probably need to push my h6 pawn. Notice the knight is here. There is a bishop on this diagonal, so I probably should push h6, the same as my opponent has pushed a3. But I decided to go ahead and castle first. Now my opponent moves their c-pawn, and now, look, we are absolutely 100% in what I would call the Queen's Gambit Declined line. Now, our move order has been absolutely, completely backwards in almost every way possible, and we have ended up in a weird situation. But we fully know, like, we've played this game before, so it's fine. So now I'm debating, do I push h6? Do I capture? Because I understand that is one of the lines, is capture. It does shift the bishop off of this strong diagonal, which would kind of be good, right? I capture, and then the opponent captures back. Now, granted, in this case, the opponent could slide their bishop back to, say, c2, but notice the queen is prevented from coming to d3, so there is no threat of checkmate. So I feel pretty good there as well. In this instance, I decide, you know what? I really don't know the best choice. I probably should have gone with h6. This was a great opportunity to do that, but I wanted to continue to develop. I know that sometimes playing the Queen's Gambit, my B pawn can become a target. If I were to undefend my B pawn, the opponent's queen comes out, puts another defender here on this square, as well as attack my B pawn. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my fianchetto structure, get my bishop on this nice long diagonal. And my opponent makes this strong queen move. So now there is pressure along this diagonal. Now I think it might be too late. So this is what's going through my mind at this point in time. Is it too late to push h6? If I push h6, I'm really not helping my case for this penetration, right? If my opponent gets their bishop all the way down to h7, it does come with check. It's not checkmate. It does come with check. Now I can slide my bishop underneath my h-pawn. So on one hand, I leave it here and prepare for pushing my g6 pawn, which then kind of barricades so my opponent can't infiltrate. But that does weaken, the g5 square for the knight, because now I've pushed one of my pawns in front of my king, and I really don't want to push a second one. Then the debate is, okay, well, if I push the h3 pawn, yes, it gives my opponent this strong diagonal to control, but notice if I do have to slide over and hide on the h-file, my king does have a little bit of protection with my pawn sitting up on h6. So these are the thoughts that are going through my head, and I haven't made a decision. And this is one of the faults that I have, I guess. Like if you look at my time here, I spent 5 seconds, realized, you know what, I still haven't made a decision yet, right? Like I've been thinking about this h6 pawn move for, well, I really started considering it right around here. So at 9:39. And 20 seconds later, I still haven't made a decision. And so I'm like, you know what? I've still got other solid developing moves that I can make. Pushing versus non-pushing is kind of a moot point, because this is still going to get infiltrated. So I'll just hold off. So I decided not to continue this thought process a lot longer. I just decided to go ahead and make a standard developing move. It's a perfectly natural developing move, and I set up for it, so I'm happy with my fianchetto here. Eventually, I will get my rook over to defend this, and eventually I will get some breathing room for my king. But my opponent then quickly makes a finally makes this knight infiltration. So now there is a knight here, and we've got a lot of pressure on this particular square. A couple things that I want to point out. This is not a checkmate threat. So I am not in danger of being checkmated. If my opponent captures, let's say my opponent captures with the bishop, my knight is still guarding this square. So I'm safe. Now, my opponent captured with the bishop. If I move my knight to capture that bishop, then my opponent I only have one defender of that knight. My opponent has 2 attackers, and they have now freed up their queen. That does become checkmate. So this knight, if my opponent captures the pawn now, if my opponent captures the pawn, Joseph, get your arrows together, man, golly. If my opponent captures my pawn now, I cannot use my knight to take back, because that immediately leads to checkmate. But if my opponent takes my pawn, I still have an option just to slide underneath that pawn. It's not a great option. Like, I'm not happy about it, but it is an option. So my opponent were to, let's say I make a bad move, my opponent can capture, I can hide underneath it, and if we quickly look, if we quickly look at the engine now, the engine says white does have a slight advantage. It's not huge. It's not checkmate danger. Yeah, black is still threatening to capture this pawn, which is not much, but it's something. So my king is not safe. I'm definitely not safe here. In this case, I'm betting my opponent had kind of wished they hadn't castled so that their rook was sitting along this long outside row, you know, heck, they could even start driving this pawn all the way down and look at busting open the position this way. So there are some options. So this is what was going through my mind at this point in time was, yeah, and look at before this, black has a slight advantage. It's not much, but it is a slight advantage, or at least even. You know, if we want to call +1, -1 even, really is what we should be calling it, because the number of times either one of us drops a pawn. So let's just say it's even. So we're even right now, and even if my opponent takes and I just move my king out of the way, I'm still okay. So this is the thought process. This knight is defending checkmate. If the queen ends up on the h square, my knight has to be there to take it. So I cannot move this knight from defense of this, unless my knight cuts off the bishop-queen battering ram. Let's turn on the engine, see what the engine says. Yeah, the engine says don't worry about it. The engine says just continue on capturing like normal. But I decided to go with this move, knight to e4. Now, what knight to e4 does is it cuts off the range of my opponent's bishop and queen. And notice, even if they take, I take back, and they take, I still have time to capture here before the queen can get all the way down to infiltrate. Right? So we see bishop captures, pawn recaptures, queen recaptures. Now there is a threat, queen knight. There is a threat of checkmate, queen knight, but my bishop can then pick up the knight and eliminate the threat of checkmate. And granted, it's an undefended knight, so I would actually go up material, but my opponent's queen is now kind of in the middle of the board. There are other threats that I have to worry about. For instance, if this bishop got up here, the queen could easily, you know, look at something along that line, but that's neither here nor there. My whole point was, by moving my knight up here to cut off this battery, I feel a little bit safer. So that's the route that I decided to take. And I did take some time, about 30 seconds on this move. Yeah, almost 30 seconds exactly. Is that right? 28? Yeah, 18 seconds plus 13 seconds. Yeah, about 30 seconds, 31 seconds. To make sure that I wasn't missing anything. Captures, captures back, captures. Now, thankfully, I do have time to pick this up and save myself some damage. Now, what happens if your opponent captures the other way? Captures, so knight captures knight, bishop, and then pawn captures back. So we're even on material. Bishop captures. Now there still is the threat of this long diagonal, right? My opponent has now taken out the long diagonal, but I do now have, I have eliminated one of the possible threats, so I can push a pawn, or I can get, you know, I can, you know, maybe get a threat of my own somewhere, somehow. Yeah, but I was basically trying to eliminate all three of these if I could eliminate some of them. So that's what I did. And notice my opponent, let me turn the engine on real quick. If my opponent had just captured here, then I capture, they capture back, notice it still gives white an advantage, right? They still have this long diagonal of influence. I was considering pushing here. Actually, the engine says that's not a great push, but at least it cuts off this threat. Now, my opponent still has a dark square bishop, so it means this threat becomes more important. But, you know, if I can tuck my bishop, my dark square bishop down here, kind of like a fianchetto structure, then that's not so bad, right? So that was kind of my thought process. A little bit more visual there. All right, but my opponent decided to sacrifice a piece to expose my king. And this is something I had not considered. This was a sacrifice that my opponent made in order to try to disrupt my king's safety. They then took with check, my pawn took back, and they took the queen takes with check. Now, in this case, this f pawn becomes a very good tool. I did not consider it at all. I simply considered what happens if I tuck my king back under, down to g8? Does my opponent have anything along this long h-file? Luckily, no, they don't. And tucking my king back to g8 means it gets on a light square. My opponent is left with a dark square bishop. I feel a little bit better. So at this point in time, I didn't know what the evaluation was. Let me let this evaluation finish up before I turn it off. I didn't know what the evaluation was, but it felt okay. Not great, but okay. Technically, I'm up in material a little bit, right? My opponent sacrificed a knight for a pawn. And then otherwise, I gave up a pawn. So let's see, I'm down 2 pawns, I think. Yeah. My opponent has all of their pawns, and I'm missing 2 pawns, but I'm up a piece. So my opponent sacrificed a knight for 2 pawns and my king's safety. So I felt okay, but not great. Yeah, and the evaluation says that I actually have an almost 3-point advantage. Go figure. Now from here, I wanted to get some defense on this square. Now notice, my light square bishop is not in a great spot to get help here. I'd like to get it. I've got a couple options that I would like to do with my knight, maybe to... I don't really have any good options, and there's no good discoveries. Like, plus even if I were to move, my opponent can simply just infiltrate this way, because this bishop isn't protected yet. So I've still got to get some protection on this bishop before I can consider trying to reroute it around to, protect the h-file. But in this case, it's okay. I've got other options. So my opponent makes a queen move. I'm not sure what this queen move is for. It's a little... like I said, I think they want to get to the h-file. Maybe they're going to do that by coming like this or like this. I think they're wanting to get to the h-file. But I'm not certain. So either way, my opponent makes a queen move. I get my bishop up and out of the way. I'm starting to get pressure along this diagonal. Notice I now do have 2 strong bishops. So I'm sort of up in material. I've got 2 strong bishops. I'm feeling okay. My queen is eventually going to come up here, possibly to defend, this. I hate to use my queen as a pawn in this chain, but we'll get the queen up here for defensive purposes. At this point in time, I'm starting to consider what happens if my opponent forks one of my pieces. These pawns are going to become a pain in my backside, right? I don't want to trap any of my pieces, but I continue with my plan of getting my queen up. Notice I now have created a fork. So I am now going to drop a piece, but I'm already up a piece, and I'm going to show you something. I'm okay with it. There's no threats along this diagonal that's coming at me, so my bishop is safe. I do have 2 strong bishops, and if I give back one of my pieces like that, now actually before I take with the queen, even if I take with the bishop here, now I've basically traded a piece for 2 pawns. So we both traded a piece for 2 pawns, so we're back dead even in material. And I have a pair of bishops slicing down towards my enemy's king. I decide to capture back with the queen. It does give me a little bit more mobility if I do decide to try to slide over to the h-file, give a little bit more defense there. Notice I could not have done that before. But also, it creates my own battering ram. So now I have a queen-bishop battery. And I have another bishop, which if I need to transfer, I can, if I need to force a queen trade or transfer my queen to a different diagonal, I can. So my opponent is now under attack. So my counterattack is in full force. And my opponent misses it. Unfortunately, they had a few options. Let's go back here. Let's see what the engine said. Yeah, engine says definitely take with the queen. It's not huge difference. A half a point to a point evaluation between the two, so not a big difference. But I go ahead and pick up, and my opponent has several options to defend, right? They have to defend their h2 pawn. Or I should say the h2 square, really, not the pawn, the square itself. They could have pushed a central pawn, but notice pushing this pawn here allows me to force a queen trade, or, or look at infiltrating with my own bishop. Right? It would weaken this diagonal even more. My opponent could have pushed their bishop here. So there are a lot of things that could go wrong for my opponent, and unfortunately they missed a few of them. It's not, I mean, it's still only a 2-point swing right now, you know? And my opponent has several ways they could defend, so it's not that big of a spread here, right? It's not a non-winnable game. It's still basically even. Unfortunately, like we said, one turn is all it takes. One turn is the difference between winning and losing. And in this case, my opponent lost this one. So, going back to what I said earlier, the slight differences in all these named openings, a lot of it depends on the move order, because one turn can mean the difference between a winning position and a losing position. So this, even though this is called the Cole system, we went through the Ready opening, the Indian game opening, the Yusupov Rubinstein system, and now the Cole system or Colley system. So we went through multiple openings because of the move order, and ultimately it ended up one turn was the difference between winning and losing, and I was on the winning end this time, which is always feels good. So don't kill yourself too much trying to memorize every single named opening. It's not going to do you any good, especially at our rating level, like 1300 to 1500. And I'm not putting myself in the 1500 category. I'm just saying I consider myself a 1300 player at this point, right? I have been in the 1300s long enough to say I'm a 1300. I have not cracked the 1400 barrier. And if I just finally get my toe in it, I'm still not going to consider myself at 1400 until I'm there pretty consistently. I consider myself a 1300 player now at this point. And 1300 players, we still drop major pieces, and we still do dumb things. So knowing these named openings is not crucial as it is to just play the position over the board and make good sound moves, right? Like look how early and look how much time we had left in this game. I had 7 minutes, my opponent had 8.5 minutes. We both could have spent more time trying to evaluate our moves better. You know, there's 10 minutes on the clock, we should use it. And you guys have seen games in which we have used that. This particular one just happened to go fast. But one move is all it took for me to win this game and my opponent to lose this game. So, all right, guys, go back, enjoy, play your games, have fun while you're doing it. Don't worry too much about this number, this rating number. And if you need a trick, do what I do. Make a fake account name that's not your real account name. So that way, this way you can practice in anonymity. You can practice anonymously, and then when you're ready to make your real account, then you can worry about rating. I'm not worried about my rating because whatever. Like, I'm just enjoying playing games, and I'm enjoying trying to learn, and I'm enjoying learning some of these different openings. In fact, I plan on trying to look up what this whole system is and see if maybe there's something, you know, a reason behind it. Or is it just a minor system? Or is it just a minor system that happens to have a name attached to it? I never know, because I'm not that learned when it comes to chess history. I'm learning, though, right? Little by little. Alrighty, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks for playing the games with me. I hope to keep playing more games with you so that I can learn and get better, and just keep having fun. Alright, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.